Welcome to the Celeste Stein Show. I'm your host, Dr. Celeste Stein, and I hope you will come on in here and like, share, and subscribe to my channels on BBS Radio and YouTube. We greatly appreciate you tuning in to the show where we cover news you can use, self help topics, and entertainment. Now, on today's show, we have a very special guest joining us who doesn't really need much of an introduction. But in case you didn't know, my fellow journalist, Les Trent, is an Emmy Award winning and nominated senior correspondent for CBS Media Ventures Inside Edition. He joins us today to talk about some of the many exciting stories he's covered over the years since joining the team in the fall of 2000. Les, thanks so much for being here and welcome to the show.
Dr. Stein, it is my pleasure. First of all, can you hear me okay? That's the first
Yes,
question.
absolutely.
All right. Secondly, I do have a point of clarification. Emmy nominated. We call ourselves at Inside Edition the Susan Lucci of Emmy nominations because we are nominated all the time and we always lose to Entertainment Tonight. So,
Yes.
but next year we're winning.
Of
And
course, of course. I'm speaking it into existence, see?
okay, thank you. And then also, I apologies for coming to you from our car
It's okay.
because Gwen, my wife, and I, our lives are so crazy. And we are actually en route to DC to see a few of our children.
Yay, my
Between us.
hometown. I'm
Yeah,
from DC, yes. I don't know
I love
when ever
DC.
told you that, but yeah.
No, I didn't know that. I love
Yeah,
DC. Every time I go there, I say I could totally live here. It's got such a great vibe to it. So
yeah.
anyway, so we're going, and this was something that came up at the last minute. We're a blended family. So I have a son and a daughter, and then I have two stepdaughters, and they live in all different parts of the country. So we're always doing something on the weekends. And so again, apologies for coming to you from the car. I know it's
No
not the
problem.
best. It's not the best look.
I said, well, I know he's a man on the go. I just really appreciate your taking the
Oh,
time and
it's
being
my
here
pleasure.
today. Thank you so much. Well, I know you've been a journalist for many moons, over 2 decades, but I actually wanted to take you back to the beginning and ask you how you actually got started in journalism.
Oh yeah, it was actually, oh my goodness, I graduated college in 82, so it's more like, what is it, 40. And I think I was fortunate in that I grew up in Canada. My mother was Canadian, my father was
Wow.
American.
Hmm.
So I'm actually an American citizen. I was born in Cleveland, but I spent my formative years in Canada, and I went to college in Toronto. But I was living in a border town right across from Buffalo called Fort Erie. That's
Hmm.
where I went to high school. So when I say I was fortunate in that I was an American citizen living in Canada. So when I graduated college, I had two jobs. My first job was at the local newspaper in Canada,
Hmm.
where I actually sold advertising copy. So I would go around, I would make up ads for the small businesses and go around and sell them ad space. And then I got a job working over the overnight shift at a radio station. So I
Hmm.
would go back and forth across that international border, you know, every day.
Wow.
Um, and like I say, I was fortunate that I was able to work in the States and live in Canada. And eventually I moved back to the States. I moved to Buffalo, where I started not just my radio career, but then I went into television in Buffalo, and I worked at a couple of TV stations there. Starting off behind the scenes, I was a weekend producer.
Hmm.
So that is basically someone, as you know, who puts the whole show together, writes most of it. You have a skeleton crew, so you
Right.
learn how to do everything. And I went from there. I would hang out with the reporters all the time because that was my ultimate goal, was to get on air. So I would
Hmm.
hang out with them, and when they were done writing their stories, I would steal their tape and I would write my own story to put a demo tape together. And
Right.
so I put a demo tape together, and they said, "Okay, we'll hire you as a reporter." And they hired me as a reporter for 3 days a week, but I was still producing the weekends.
Hmm.
So um, So I was like, this is too much, and I got a job offer across town to anchor the weekends, and so I went across town and anchored the weekends, and we were the my co-anchor and I were the first black co-anchor team in the
Wow.
city of Buffalo. Sandy
That,
White, a friend of mine who's still in Buffalo. She and I were the first African American anchor team in Buffalo, and I went from there to San Francisco, and we can go on and on, but
yeah.
I
Yeah,
I was I think I was fortunate though in that I only worked in two local markets before I started working on national shows. Because as you know, in this business, people spend a lot of time moving from market to market, which is something I never really wanted to do. So I was fortunate in that I worked in Buffalo, San Francisco, and then I started working for national shows.
right. I know when I got started, I worked at WHUR radio, and I was there with like Melvin Lindsay when he was starting
Wow.
Quiet Storm, and people like Alvin Jones, who was the first, I think, VJ, the unseen VJ on
Right.
BT. Uh,
Wow.
uh, Kathy Hughes was the general manager. I mean, I had no idea what rock stars I was really working, but I started as an intern, an unpaid intern, and a couple of people said, "This girl's working harder than anyone we have in here." And they went up to Kathy Hughes and lobbied for me to get paid. So I started working for them, but I was in school in Atlanta at Spelman College, and I made all my friends. I was like, I don't think I could actually like leave all of that and come
Right.
back to Howard, and I kind of wanted to get. I was the rebel in my family. I was the one that wanted to get away, so ended up going back. But they were like, "Oh, you're in Atlanta, where the Atlanta child murders are going on. Do you think you could cover up that
Oh
for?"
my goodness.
I was like, Could I? And I'm gonna get paid? What? You know, like, so I ended up covering, the Wayne Williams trial. And
Wow.
I mean, just the people I met. I mean, it's like the editors of Time and Newsweek were in there. Deborah Roberts was, I think, working for a TV station, maybe in Macon, Georgia. I mean, just to meet people like that, people from Associated Press that, it's like if you cross people's paths, years later, it's just such a small world, but very interesting. And as you were saying earlier, just to explain to the audience, television has these market sizes, from 1 to like 300, and they're
Right.
ranked by demographics and how large the city is and how metropolitan, etc. And so to be able to start someplace like DC, which is like a top 10 market. I mean, I had no idea, obviously, at the time, but, and then
Right.
Atlanta and my friend, one of my friends, they used to call us kind of the Brack Pack. When I went back to Atlanta, she became the news director at V103 in Atlanta. So she was like, Marjorie's like, hey, you better come over here and help me. So I gotta get some carts
Wow.
up over here.
Well, it's interesting. I love your origin story because there are so many stories like that, especially among people of color,
Mhm.
and it reminds me of one thing that you hear a lot of criticism about the media, especially from the right wing media about the liberal media,
Right.
and I think that what is lost in that is this. When I worked in San Francisco, there was an anchor at the at what was his name? I'm having a mental block, but it was a black anchor in town. They were like number one forever,
Mhm.
and he got his job because he happened to have been working at the TV station. He might have even had like a janitorial job or something, and there were riots, and they said, hey, we need you to go out and cover these stories in neighborhoods of color. And so there are a lot of us who started in the business because there was a need for people of color to tell our stories. And I
Yes.
think that and it's not just people of color. It was also white reporters who were covering the civil rights marches, for instance. And
Right.
when you are covering something like that, and you can go back to the Dan Rathers of the 1960s, and you're covering good versus evil. There's an obvious tendency to want to point out the evil part of it, and
Yes.
that today, that kind of coverage today, strangely, would be considered liberal media. When you
Hmm.
think about covering something, like the Bull Connors of the world, there are actually people today on the right who would look at it and say that kind of coverage is slanted, when really what you're doing is you're covering just the truth of this oppression that was going on. But there there are a lot of reporters whose DNA is covering the
Hmm.
civil rights movement, and so
Right.
that is, so whenever I hear somebody talk about the liberal media, I always think that they really have not gotten into the genesis of what journalism was back in the 60s and 70s, and
Right.
how
And
a
how
lot of
much
people
of that.
got into this. Yeah.
Hmm. That reminded me, just being in school in Atlanta and being able to cover some of those stories. By the time I graduated, I was working at Georgia Public Television doing a show called The Lawmakers. So every day, instead of going to class, I was doing all my classes independent study, and I would cover the legislature. I would go down there and listen all day, have to like time code everything, and work with a producer to kind of get everything written up, for the show. It was like a 1 hour nightly newscast that aired from 6 to 7. But at that time, what was so interesting is that we got to meet people like, Julian Bond, who was, a senator at the time, and Andrew Jackson, Andrew Young, but Maynard Jackson, all
Right.
these people that were there under the direction of Governor Zell Miller at the time, and so just to have that experience, but to learn a little bit about politics and civil rights. I also was thinking when I was in school, my my roommate at the time, her best friend was dating Dexter King. So,
Oh boy.
and obviously, to pay homage to him, he, passed this week.
Yeah,
And
last week. Yeah.
I would come to my dorm room and he would be sitting there, you know, hanging out, I, I mean,
I
that,
know. And
you
he
know,
and he of all of his children looked the most like his father.
yeah. So I'd be
Yeah, it was.
frozen. I'd be sitting on the edge of my bed going, oh my God, like that's Dexter
Wow.
King.
But
He's
it's interesting too that when you talk about having to sit there and transcribe, you know, things that are happening, and then turn around and turn it and find those sound bites, or find those parts of the story that are relevant to the day's news. That is a skill that is really, it takes a while to gain that skill, because I remember being
Yeah.
overwhelmed covering something like a court case, where you're
Mhm.
listening to all of this information, and
Yeah.
then you have to narrow it down to a minute 30 story, and then do a live shot around it in like 2 hours. And I
Right.
just remember that feeling of sitting there and in a courtroom, for instance, or covering something with the legislature, and being completely overwhelmed,
Right.
but you have no choice but to get it done. And that's the problem with some of I hate to use the word the kids, some of the kids today who say, I don't want to work in a small market. I want to start in New York City.
Mm.
And they don't understand that learning all of that stuff is
Yeah.
what makes you better, which makes you better at everything else.
Yeah, I mean the note taking, they give you
Oh,
those little reporter notebooks and you have a ton of them. Well,
yeah.
when I was in Lynchburg, I actually worked in the Lynchburg Roanoke market. And my very first day on the job, this is a funny story. Um, they said we're going to send you to a like a town hall meeting that was happening in Amherst County, Virginia. So it was probably, about 30, 40 minutes from the station. So they said we're going to send you with another one of the reporters, and he's going to go and he's going to just kind of help you and kind of show you the ropes and stuff. Well, thank God for Danny Deal. Thank God Danny Deal came, because it was like Appalachia, and the southern drawl, the draw, I couldn't
You
understand
can understand what they're saying.
a word that was being said. I was terrified. I said, I'm going to get fired on my first day on the job. Like I couldn't understand. And I mean, I said, I was like grabbing him. I said, I don't know what they're, I don't know what they're saying. And it went on for, it was like one of those 2 or 3 hour meetings that you're just sitting there. It's like,
Oh
whoo.
my goodness.
So he said, "Don't worry, I'm going to help you." We deciphered everything and got to
Wow.
the main point. But they cover so many points. You're like, "What if this is news?" Especially if I can't understand it. But we finally got there. But
Trial by fire.
oh yes, for sure, for sure. That, and I'm sure there are many stories like that of journalists that journalists have. And I mean, I just remember that whole time that they still, at that point in time, they had smoking in the newsroom, and
Oh
they
my God, I remember it. Oh,
well, but anyway,
I remember it well.
things have changed, right?
Yes.
Thankfully. Um,
Yeah.
so let's talk about some of the most memorable stories you've unfolded over the years. One that really stood out to me is the feature story that you did on the homeless man with the golden voice.
Oh, yes.
My goodness, like that story, it just touched, I think, so many people.
Yes.
So how did you find him?
Well, it's one of those stories where that started in with, as most do, with a local news story. We had seen this report, and it blew up. It was everywhere.
Hmm.
So my assignment desk, and this is how it works at Inside Edition. Something happens somewhere, and you get a phone call, or you're sitting at your desk, and someone will say, "Oh, you need to get on a plane to so and so." So uh, that morning, it, someone, the assignment desk called me, and they said, "I forgot where it was. Do you remember what town it was in?" Um,
I
hmm, I don't remember. Anyway,
yeah, no, I don't remember either.
I could look it up. I'm using my phone. Anyway, so I was on the next plane. It was somewhere cold. I remember that. And at this point, he had been inundated with media requests.
Mm,
So he was actually doing a live radio um, interview when I finally arrived in the city. So we go to the radio station and we're waiting to interview him. Now, we're a news magazine show, so there's a lot more to telling a story than just interviewing somebody. So I
mm,
had to take him back to the place where he lived under a bridge at that intersection, and there's just a lot of so-called B-roll that we have to get in order to make a story work. But he was being harassed so much by the media that I had to, you know, I have to corral him for myself for
mhm,
at least an hour or two. So the challenge in telling a news magazine story is that you want it to look as exclusive as possible. So in addition to shooting my interview with him, I'm also fending off all the other press, and I'm saying to them, listen, you can do this when I'm done, but I need this time. I need this time alone. I can't have other cameras in my shot. And
mm,
and it
mhm,
makes storytelling a little bit more difficult when you are telling a story that you want to give an exclusive look to.
right.
So we were lucky enough to squirrel him away, to take him back to the site where he had been living, to get video of him with his signs, and 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 we also followed up with that story because it was such an amazing story. I don't know if you remember, but he ended up getting a contract with with Kraft macaroni and cheese, and he was doing commercials for them.
Mhm.
And he actually has a voiceover career as a result of those stories. I believe we were
Yeah.
probably one of the first national shows
Mhm.
to put him on, and so we're proud of that we were able to tell his story.
Yeah, and I mean, just look at the impact that one story had on that man's life, and
Hmm.
I mean, that's
Yeah,
almost like something that just was meant to be. That
absolutely.
what an incredible job you did on that
Yeah,
story. It's just
thank you.
one of those things that really stands out in my mind. But are there other stories that you find to be like highly memorable in your mind? Like, what is kind of in your mind one of your most memorable stories to cover?
Well, I mean,
So many
I,
of them.
there's so many. The ones that are memorable are the ones that you don't want to remember. You know,
Mm,
Sandy
mm,
Hook. I was there that morning. 9/11, Oklahoma City. I unfortunately covered way too many of those awful stories. Parkland High School,
yeah.
um, and it's. I was thinking about Sandy Hook in particular, driving up there that morning and not knowing the just how awful it was going to be.
Mm,
At first, we heard these stories that it was somebody in the office who had brought a gun and accidentally shot themselves in the foot. We're hearing all these kind of benign stories that that really and as you're driving up there as a reporter, you're praying to yourself, please make this not be awful. Please
right.
make it not be awful, especially when you have children. And
Absolutely.
yeah, and then to arrive there, there were scenes that um, that are obviously seared into your mind, but you go sometimes from being a journalist to being a parent.
Right.
And there was one scene in particular. We were parking our car a couple of blocks away from the school, and I saw this woman, and you knew just by looking at her that it was a mother, and
Mm,
she was racing to the school, and there was this look on her face,
mm,
and I said to my camera crew, "Do not put a camera in that woman's face.
right.
Let her be."
Right.
Now, when you look at stories in the newspaper, you might see an image of that woman shot from afar,
Mm,
but to put a television camera in someone's face
right.
is a
Yeah.
lot more invasive. And so
Mm,
there's
right.
there's actually a bit of a disadvantage to covering a story like that because you're trying to be as sensitive as possible. And there was nothing to be gained for me to stick my camera in that woman's face. Um,
Absolutely.
so so yeah, unfortunately the bad stories are the ones you remember. But I think one of my most memorable stories was I spent 2 weeks with Michael Jackson
Oh my
in yes,
gosh.
in Auckland, New Zealand, and Bangkok, Thailand. And it was
Nice.
right after his last trial. And he
Mm,
was on something, I think it was the Victory Tour at the time.
mm-hmm.
And it was a weird thing. I was actually covering another story and I get a phone call from my assignment desk and they said, "Hey," and this was back in the days when Inside Edition was owned by the King brothers. So it was a
Hmm.
King World production. If you remember,
I do
at
remember
the end at
that.
the end of all of these syndicated shows like Oprah, Wheel of Fortune,
Right.
Jeopardy, it would
Hmm.
say King World production. Well, we were part of King World.
Hmm.
The King brothers started Inside Edition. And I was shooting this story. I'll never forget. I was in Omaha shooting a story, and I get a phone call, and my assignment desk, one of my managing editors said, "Listen, we Michael Jackson has a lawyer who's a friend with one of our lawyers, and he owes him a favor. So they're going to let us tag along in Auckland, New Zealand, and Bangkok, Thailand with him. And the only thing is, um, he's not going to give us an interview, but you can shoot all the B-roll you want, and you're going to be right. You're going to be part of his entourage." And so,
Wow.
sure enough, the first place we went was, I think the first place was Auckland. It was New Zealand,
Hmm.
and we So we get there, we're staying in the same hotel as him. We've got we have a contact person, and every time Michael Jackson did something, they would call to our room and they would say, okay, Mr. Jackson is going to a record store. Meet us in the lobby. So we'd go to the lobby and we would get in our car and we were part of their entourage. So we're driving with a police escort. We go to a record store. They close down the record store. Michael Jackson is walking around buying records. I'm standing 10 feet from him doing stand-ups. And here we are in a record store, blah, 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 blah. And it's just surreal, because you're thinking, here I am with this, this king of pop.
Yeah.
I can't ask him any questions, but he's right over my shoulder.
Hmm.
And then what happened is we he did a tour of a hospital. And so he's in the hospital room and I'm there with my camera crew right there in the hospital room as he's talking to these kids. And my sound guy was in there with a boom mic.
Hmm.
And Michael Jackson looks at our boom mic and he says to his guys, because he had camera, Michael Jackson shot everything.
Hmm.
Everywhere he went, he had a camera crew.
Oh,
He
wow.
looks at he looks at our camera crew and he looks at our boom mic and he goes, "Hey, how come we don't have a boom mic?" And so I said to him, I said, anything if you want any of this video, we'll get it to you. And then we walk out to the hallway and Michael Jackson is just standing there. So I looked at my camera crew and I just walked up and I started asking him a few questions. And his PR person goes, hey, no interviews. And I said, that's not an interview. I just asked him a question. And that actually happened a few more times between Auckland, New Zealand and Bangkok, Thailand, where he would just be there and I just like, hey, blah, 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 blah. And that was enough. The
So,
video that we shot in that time and those few little sound bites that I got with him, the one-on-ones, was enough to give us, I don't know, 10 stories.
that's really cool, man. What a
So it was,
story.
yeah, that was pretty incredible.
Yeah.
Um,
I
and
got you remember the trial up in Chicago when I was in graduate school at Northwestern. The trial was up there where with that Paul McCartney song, "The Girl Is Mine."
the girl is mine.
Yeah, so I got to cover that while I was in school
Wow.
because we were assigned actual TV stations, and so that was one, and yeah, I mean, it's just he's fascinating, really to even be able to kind of be in his
Yeah,
presence. There's so many people that wanted to interview him and what have you, but I mean, he is just incredible. Like so,
yeah,
wow, and that is a story.
yeah. Yeah. I mean, there've been a few there've been a few celebrities. We don't really cover the celebrity stuff as much as we used to. We used to actually compete more with Entertainment Tonight. Now we are we do entertainment, but we're a news magazine show, so we cover whatever the news of the day is. But I also had I had a fun encounter with James Brown. I think it was months or maybe a year before he died, and he was performing in New York City, and it was a small venue, and we were going to get one-on-one with him in his dressing room just before he went on stage, and his press person came up to me and he goes, "Whatever you do, you must refer to him as Mr. Brown. Do not call him James Brown." I said,
Mm.
it puts the fear of the Lord in you. I'm like, okay, I
That
got it, Mr. Brown.
yeah.
So, uh, so we finally are given the go ahead to walk into his dressing room. He's waiting for us. So the door opens up and we walk in. And he's sitting there with his wife, and I walk in and I go, Mr. Brown. He goes, how you doing? I watch Inside Edition all the time. He says, call me James.
We're like,
And
"Phew."
but I think, and I come to find out that that was the thing. I think they used to tell all the journalists, you must refer to him as Mr. Brown, and then he would say, call me James.
I have a funny one like that. I was covering George Bush Jr. came he loved country music, so he came to Nashville for the CMAs, and everybody was like out at Opryland Hotel in Nashville, and so we were out in the parking lot, and they were like, they let a couple of journalists in to, do interviews, and I'm like looking around, I'm like seeing Johnny Cash to my right, Glenn
Oh
Campbell
my
here.
God.
I mean, it's just all the greats, right? And then Dolly Parton kind of walked right in front of me. So I said, "Excuse me." I was like, "Would you mind doing an interview?" She was so nice.
I love Dolly.
Yeah,
I love
she
her.
was awesome. But she turns around, right? So my photographer, he's great. He was a photographer for a long, long time, but he pulled out the lavalier and went over to like pin the lavalier on her, and his hand started shaking. And she was like, "Oh, honey," she was just like, "It's gonna be all right." And then he just looked at me. He said, "You do it," like he just handed
Well,
me like,
that's funny because I have so many photographer friends who have Dolly Parton stories like that, and she is always disarming and telling them, you know, this ain't my first rodeo. Go ahead, do what you got to do.
"Go ahead." Yeah, she was so nice. Like I was like, "Really? You're gonna put this on me?" Like, but yeah. But yeah,
Hysterical.
just meeting all those country music folks, just it's interesting all the things you have to deal with kind of behind the scenes from handlers, because a
Oh,
lot of them have,
handlers are the worst.
yeah, and
Handlers,
some are
yeah,
good, some are,
some are good, but I think most people don't realize that that the handlers are the ones that can make or break your day and can
yeah,
be unreasonable.
right.
And I remember I'm not talking out of school because I've told this story before, but it was a Super Bowl and Paul McCartney was performing,
I remember
and
that. Yeah.
we were on the sidelines. When we cover the Super Bowl, we have great access. We're on the sidelines, and then we get to come out and shoot the halftime show. And um, so I'm standing on the sidelines, and I look over, and Paul McCartney is 20 feet from me, and
Wow.
his press person is like, he is not doing any interviews. I'm like, okay. So
All right.
you're like, I'm standing 20 feet from a beetle and I can't ask him any questions, and it's just frustrating. And and I'm looking at Paul McCartney, and he is looking up at they're playing on the huge monitors a Beatles retrospective, and he's sitting there and he's watching it, and he's watching it the same way we are. He's like, oh my God, this is amazing. He's looking at his career like, oh, it's so it's so I he was just about to walk out onto the field to perform. And I said to him, I walked up to him and I said, isn't this amazing? You're here at the Super Bowl. And he goes, yeah, it's amazing, isn't it? And, uh, and that's all I got from him. His press person, of course, cut me the nastiest look.
Oh,
But
oh,
when you're putting a story together
right.
about covering the Super Bowl and you get that much from Paul McCartney, it made the story.
Yeah. Oh, I'm sure. I mean, that was enough, right?
It was enough. But
Yeah.
if you listen to their press people, you'd be like,
Yeah.
if you listen to their handlers, you wouldn't get anything.
And those are the things that make stories so it gives it that extra oomph, that actually helps in telling the story. You want to hear from
Yeah,
people, but I understand they have so many people who want to do the same thing that
yeah,
so you obviously have to take chances sometimes and
you do.
that microphone out there and ask that question. You never know
Yeah.
what you get, right?
Now the thing that is really fortunate thing for us is that we don't cover entertainment 24/7. So if this were ET, if I were working at ET and I had gone against the wishes of the press person, that could have been catastrophic because you would never get them again. But
Right.
since it's so infrequent that we actually cover it, it was fine.
You're like, right, exactly. All right. Slap my hand later, right?
Exactly. Whoops.
Well, I want to take a quick break. And when we come back, we're going to be chatting with Les Moore. of the news business and how much it has changed over the years. We'll be back right after this. A lot of things have come to a screeching halt due to COVID 19, but you should know that the court system in Tennessee is still open and holding in person hearings for orders of protection and other types of abuse cases. If you have a hearing date, double check on where your hearing will be held. If you need assistance on an order of protection or temporary restraining order, contact the Legal Aid Society at 1 800 238 1443 or visit our website at www.las.org. And welcome back. You are listening to the Celeste Stein Show, and we are chatting with Inside Edition senior correspondent Les Trent. And Les, over the past 2 decades, what are some of the most notable changes you've seen in the news business? And you know, talking about like how it was when you started versus now. What are some of the biggest things you've noticed?
Woo, wow. Well, I think there's been a move away from really good hardcore journalism storytelling. I think that
Mm,
the attention spans are so much shorter these days that um, we really are getting, I mean, the stories just are a lot shorter and they're not nearly as in depth as they were when you and I started in the business. Um, Even a news magazine show, our stories are shorter than they used to be. But here's I think it was really the brilliance of our show, and that is that the stories that we initially did for Inside Edition and the sister show that I worked for, which was called American Journal, which was on from 93 to 98, and it was canceled, and then I came back to Inside Edition after that. But the stories we did back then were 6 and 7 minutes long, and that was normal for what we call a news magazine story because we really get behind the nitty gritty of a story and tell things about the story that that you wouldn't see in the local news or even the national news, and that still is the case to this day. But instead of 6 minute stories that we used to tell back then, we now tell that same sort of news magazine style story in a minute and a half. So whereas we used to have 3 or 4 stories in the show, we might now have 15, 16, 17 stories in the show. And I think when I say the brilliance of Inside Edition, I I'm talking about our our co-EPs, Charles Lockman and Esther Pesson, really have owned this skill of telling a story with all of these different elements from all over the world in a single story. And it's only a minute and a half to 2 minutes long, and you still feel like you got behind the scenes of the story. For us, that is a major difference. When you talk about the traditional news cast, your local news, if you watch today, um, you're getting the headlines, but you're not really getting the depth that we used, I believe, that we infused in our stories back in the 80s when I started. And I think that is just a function of people's lack of attention these days. Um, you don't have you have way too many options these days for viewing and for news, and that's another reason why the stories are so much shorter. Because if you wake up in the morning, as I do, and the first thing you do is go to your news feed,
mm,
by 6 o'clock at night, that news is old.
right.
And so news directors have to find new and innovative ways to tell stories that people have heard about throughout the entire day.
Right.
And that alone is going to make your stories shorter. And I think that it just takes a little more creativity to to tell some stories with depth. these days.
I was going to ask you too. I know, being in a large city like New York, we would also often, like in the news place that I was last, which was Nashville. Nashville's a fairly big market. It's market size 29 and growing. But it would be pretty easy for us to get around, at that time. It's getting
Right.
more and more congested. But where you are, I mean, how do you like get from point A to point B to actually cover a story? Is that pretty difficult in terms of working behind the scenes and getting the news that you need?
No, it's actually easier today because the technology has improved considerably. So back in the old days, for instance, even if I were sent across town to shoot a story, and if you're in Manhattan, it can take you an hour and a half to get across town. Um, Back then, we would have to go shoot our story, and then we'd have to bring it back to the studio, and we would have to, only then could we start the editing process. I would have to come back also because I would have to go into the tracking booth, as we call it, which is the voiceover booth, and I would have to voice over the story. Today, we have something called a live view. A live view is a device that looks like it's mm, it looks like a backpack, and it is a device that you take the card from your, or you can plug your camera right into it, and it has inside of this little device um, the equivalent of 5 or 6 cell phones. And so what we're doing is we're transmitting that almost like you would with your cell phone directly into our control room. And so I could shoot a story. I could actually shoot it through the live view, and it would go live into the control room. So if I have a 3 o'clock deadline and I have an interview at 2:45 on the other side of town, my cameraman and I can plug the camera into the live view. It'll go directly to our control room, and the editor can then start editing right then and there.
Amazing.
Then, yeah, and then instead of me having to physically come back to voice my story from the sound booth, I now use this trusty thing called my cell phone, and they have a device that plugs into my cell phone, and I have a good microphone, and I voice my story right into my cell phone. It makes a file, and I send that file to my producer, and they put it right into the system there. So everything is a lot easier these days. Even when I go on the road, I can bring a live view with me. I've got my voiceover gear that fits in my bag, and things are they were a way easier.
I can just remember just how heavy that stuff was.
Oh,
Crazy enough, in my class at Northwestern, it was 10 women. And of course, everybody was the size, you if you remember
right.
TV, but
Oh, yes.
young people look it up. But anyway, it was like, the tripod weighed about 20 pounds. The camera weighed about, the deck you had to carry was like 40 pounds. That's the world I came from, and then you also had, things like the sound and, the boom mic and, you know,
That's right.
go out in teams of like, three and cover this stuff. And all that stuff was so heavy. Now, with backpack journalism, like you said, you could just throw it on your back and
Yeah.
anybody can cover it. So that one good thing about that, certainly it opened up a lot of opportunities for women in the news business as well. So a lot of changes there. But
Yeah, that is true.
um, also, I think we probably saw, I know you did a lot of coverage of COVID-19. Who didn't, if you were a
Mhm.
journalist? What
Absolutely.
are some of the things that maybe changed there in terms of how news was covered? And are you seeing some of those things continue?
Oh, absolutely. Um, of course, we never did Zoom interviews back before COVID. Um, and what happened with COVID is that we were all working remotely as much as we could.
Mm,
So I set up a little studio at my house and I would do Zoom interviews all day.
mm,
And they would connect from my office. I would connect on the Zoom, and then the person we're interviewing would connect, and they would record it back in New York. And we'd put a story together. And instead of having an in-person interview, we would just use the Zoom interview. And the quality got better and better as it went along. And we, to this day, will do, you'll see 10 or 15 Zoom interviews a day in our show. And when you think about, I mean, even the attack in Israel on October 7th, I was doing interviews with survivors via Zoom in the days that followed, and that was all started during COVID. That whole technology and not just the technology, but the acceptance of seeing it on television, the acceptance of seeing uh, a reporter doing an interview over something like this. It just was not something we did every day.
right.
And now, when you see someone reporting on something and see a Zoom interview in the middle of it, it feels absolutely natural. And that was all an offshoot of COVID.
Yeah, it's definitely been normalized, I think,
Hmm.
a lot more. Also wanted to ask you, I think there's been a real paradigm shift in the business when it comes to things like fake news. And how
Right.
do you think that has impacted people's perception of true journalists? Because it seems like everyone is now kind of becoming a public figure or journalist. Everybody picks up a camera, microphone. That's just how people nowadays communicate and even brand themselves and get themselves out there. So, how, do you think the negative connotation uh, is going to be something that kind of continues?
Well, it it will continue, and I think the people who are going to have to make sure it doesn't taint the entire business are the people in the business. And that, you can't just put whatever you see on air and call it journalism. There has to be some sort of vetting that
Totally.
goes along with it. And,
Yeah.
sometimes I'll see something online and I'll think this could be a story for us, but is it real? Is it true? Is it something that somebody um that somebody orchestrated? Is it something, and you can't, first of all, nothing goes on Inside Edition that does not go through our lawyers first. And I thank God for that, because when I was in local news, you didn't have that, what I call luxury, because
You're
um
betting,
because,
yeah,
yeah, because of also, you know cell phones weren't a thing back then, wasn't that big of a thing back then, so you didn't have video coming in from all these different sources who were not news sources. Everything we put on the air when I was in local news in Buffalo and San Francisco was stuff that we shot. So again, you've got to be very careful about vetting. A lot of it's just common sense. When you see some stuff, you're like, there's no way this is real. Um, so so
and
yeah, fake news is unfortunately here, and it's for us to make sure that it doesn't see airtime.
yeah, I can
It's a tough
remember,
thing.
when I was in school at Northwestern, there was a guy who was like a financial analyst, used to come on NBC, Rukeyser, and he came and talked to our class. And at the time, there were like, your four main channels. You had UHF, VHF, the little hanger you use on the TV to try to keep
Oh yeah.
it. Anyway, he came to talk to us, and we had about 12 people in the class, and we're just sitting around a conference table. And he said, I know you all are going to find this hard to believe. He said, but right now, those few channels that you watch are going to become like 300. There are going to be hundreds of channels on cable and everywhere. And we're just looking at him like, what?
Like, what? Really?
Yeah. And then it's like, yeah, and he was talking about how he thought the business was going to change. So one of the things that he said was, he said, because there might be, fabrication of stories and things like that, and this hasn't quite happened yet. So this is to me really interesting because he was right about everything else. Um, he said they're going to be people who become experts in particular areas. He said, let's say you're seamstress, sewing is your thing. You may have a sewing channel. There's somebody else. It's cars, and there's a car channel and all that. He said eventually there will be so many things out there. Real news outlets are going to have to go to those experts to make sure that the content that they're getting is already kind of vetted and you have that trustworthy source. And I can really see that kind of thing happening. I don't really
Oh, it
know.
is happening. It is happening.
Yeah,
It
yeah.
is happening right now. In fact, um, there are a lot of people who have become or have labeled themselves experts in certain things based upon what they do for a living. We use them all the time, and uh, some of them are doctors, and some of them just happen to be lifestyle experts or whatever. But people are labeling themselves as experts at certain things, and if you watch any of the morning shows, um, or even local news is doing it these days, and we do it. Every winter we'll have somebody who is an expert telling us about, you should rake the snow off your roof if you live in a certain area because this can happen and that can happen. So
Mhm.
we are using those experts to this day, and it's happening.
What about building your own brand in news? That was usually, used to be unheard of.
Oh
But
yeah.
everybody's like, I'm so and so, and
Oh
that
yes.
is different to me. But how important do you think that is?
Brand building is very important these days. I mean, it is, you try, if you're covering straight news, not to brand yourself at all. But there are people who have built or building careers now in television, in news, by branding themselves an expert at something. It happens all the time, and it is, I have to say, it's probably the wave of the future.
Right. I think so. When
Yeah,
you
I
talk
think it is.
how things
Um, we
are
have we have about we have not that much time left, but I'm wondering if we could do this. There's a story that I would like to share, and I
absolutely.
and I I like this story because, um, it's a story that's just a regular person, regular guy who got into this crazy situation where he was actually kidnapped, and it was a case of mistaken identity.
Mm,
And the reason this story resonates with me is because if you sit down and you just watch the finished product of this story, or if you read about it online, it almost reads like fiction, and it reads like, wow, this is an interesting story. But one of the things that I think people don't stop to think about, and that is, and you've dealt with this too, I'm sure, over the years, and that is just the real person behind it. So I
mm,
was sitting across from this guy as he was telling me about this life-changing and this scary situation, and he started to tear up, and I started to tear up because I'm sitting here going, this is a real life, flesh and blood person sitting in front of me telling this story that everyone's fascinated by, but for him it's just personal.
right.
And you and I think really, when you're storytelling, when you're out there telling other people's story, um you have to always have heart. And so I love this guy. Sitting across from him, hearing him tell this story,
Yeah.
um
Can
as
we
a
take a quick
journalist,
can we take a quick look?
let's take a quick look.
Jeff Mueller still gets emotional when he talks about the worst day of his life. The day this regular Joe from New Jersey was mistaken for a swindler and kidnapped by a ruthless biker gang. That life or death drama began in this parking lot as Jeff arrived to open up his pet supply shop. The bad guys were looking for a Jeff Mueller who owed their boss money in a shady deal. Problem is, they had the wrong Jeff Mueller.
He's holding me. I'm trying to struggle to get out. I've already been hit in the face, both sides. Then I'm getting kicked, and then I'm getting tasers in the back while I'm laying down.
Jeff says the gang zip-tied his hands and put a hood over his head.
You got the wrong guy. Kept on telling him that over and again. You got the wrong guy.
What did they say?
They told me I embezzled money from somebody in Missouri. I sell dog food. Why would I embezzle anybody?
The gang threw Jeff in the back seat and proceeded to drive clear across the country, through Pennsylvania, Ohio, Indiana, and beyond. Meanwhile, Jeff's wife, Gail, was desperately trying to figure out where her husband was.
What'd you think had happened?
I didn't know. I started to panic.
The couple had no enemies, as far as they knew. The cops were also baffled.
I was just so worried about him. I just couldn't figure out why he would disappear.
At some point, the knucklehead kidnappers realized they had the wrong guy. But that made things worse.
He's going bagged and tagged. Bagged and tagged.
What do you think he meant?
Well, you're in the black bag with a tag on your toe in the morgue.
Then, a miracle. They broke down at a Missouri gas station. For Jeff, it was now or never.
I'm thinking, okay, time's running out. I'm gonna have to get out of here and do something. Out the door I went.
His escape was captured on the gas station security cameras.
You were fighting for your life.
Yeah, what else? I have no choice. Screaming like a maniac. Call the cops, call 911, I've been kidnapped. I'm going nuts.
You can see Jeff pleading for help, clinging to the counter.
I'm like hanging on the counter and I finally just collapsed. And just laying on the floor.
His nightmare was over. This picture was taken just a few hours later at the hospital. Jeff's face is battered and bruised. The gang who couldn't kidnap straight was captured and charged with kidnapping.
They were driving him to his death.
Prosecutor Gregory Mueller showed us the taser the gang used to kidnap Jeff.
This was an innocent man who got kidnapped in broad daylight. He suffered greatly for a sin he never committed.
Will you ever get over this?
No, I don't think so.
All three of the kidnappers were convicted. As for the real Jeff Mueller, he's safe and well and no longer lives in New Jersey. By the way, police checked him out and they found no evidence of any wrongdoing.
Do you see this ordinary-looking building right behind me here? Inside its walls is something incredibly dangerous.
What a story. Oh my goodness.
What a story.
Yeah, that poor guy. It's like these things, I guess, are so unusual, but to get that story and be able to capture that. And I mean, you were talking about the difficulty and how, you kind of had to do a little bit of a reenactment and that kind of thing, just watching. Very interesting in how you had to kind of piece that back together. I've been in those shoes. Sometimes you're like, well, I don't, we don't have anything to show for this.
That's right.
What you got to get creative, right? In other words.
Well, that's why I wanted to end on that story, because I think it best encapsulates what a work day is like when you're telling a news magazine story, and it's why I love doing what I've been doing for the past 40 years.
And I wanted to ask you, as we wrap up here, what's on the horizon for Les Trent?
I have two Instagram pages and a YouTube channel. My YouTube channel is The Culinary Correspondent. I love to cook. I also have an Instagram called The Culinary Correspondent, and I tell a lot of stories outside of Inside Edition, for a series that I call The Road Less Travels. And so you can find all of that on Instagram and on YouTube.
Lovely, lovely. Well, I want you to know it has been an absolute pleasure to have you on our show today.
Dr.
Thanks.
Stein, the pleasure has been mine.
Thank you. Thank you. I look forward to hopefully meeting you one day. I don't know if you head to NABJ, but hopefully,
I hope
Mike,
to go there this year.
me too. So hopefully we'll see.
Where is it? Where is it this year?
Chicago.
Perfect.
Yeah.
We have a
Yeah.
we have a daughter. We have a daughter there, so it's.
All
Thank you
good.
so much.
Thank you. And that is obviously all the time we have for now. We'll see you again in 2 weeks for our next live show. And don't forget, you can catch the replays on my YouTube channel and BBS Radio. Please be sure to like, share, and subscribe. I'm your host, Dr. Celeste Stein. Thanks so much for watching.